Well, building off the idea of being able to vote and the election process itself, over the years there have been changes to the number of years a governor could serve. How has that changed? How is that process different now from the way that it used to be?
Well, originally in Tennessee, according to the first Constitution of 1796, the governor had a 2-year term, and he was term limited at 3 consecutive terms. That is, you could not be governor for more than 6 years in a row. The idea, of course, coming out of the colonial period is that we wanted to limit the power of the governor and give more power to the legislature. In fact, that was one of the major criticisms of the first Constitution. It gave too much power to the legislature and not enough to the governor. Now, when the Constitution was revised in 1835 and then again in 1870, actually totally replaced, although they did take parts of the old Constitution and bring them into the new one, they kept that same 2-year term. Now, Tennessee's Constitution then went through a long period of stasis where there was no change at all, from 1870 to 1953, which is perhaps the longest period, according to the Tennessee Blue Book, of any state to not change their Constitution. In 1953, we held a major constitutional revision at a constitutional convention, and we decided to go to a 4-year term for the governor's seat. However, the governor was term limited. That is, he could not serve 2 consecutive terms. So then we entered a period where we had what we would call leapfrog governors, where you had a 4-year governor, and then he had to leave office. Another governor came in for 4 years, and then the first one comes back, and then the second one comes back. And then that was also changed, so that now we are able to have a 4-year term with 2 consecutive terms. And then after 8 years, the governor has to leave office. He could, in theory, run again after years out, although I don't believe that's happened in Tennessee.
No, it really hasn't. And in some respects, those elections were actually quite colorful in the 50s after we revised the term limits to 1 4-year term, because you had Frank Clement, who was elected in 52, took the oath of office in 53, and then 4 years later, he is succeeded by his Secretary Commissioner of Agriculture, Buford Ellington. And you go through those, they're always referred to as the Clement-Ellington years. And if you go out and interview anybody in Tennessee who remembers those years, they saw those as very colorful years. Now, what I think is kind of interesting about those years up until the election of Winfield Dunn that Joe referred to earlier is that the Democratic Party in Tennessee seemed to really have a lock on the state political machinery. And that has not always been the case. I think that's one thing that really makes Tennessee unique from the states that we like to refer to as the solid South. The Democratic Party in Tennessee, after Reconstruction, when the ex-Confederates got their political rights back, the Democratic Party largely could control politics because they had a large majority in Middle Tennessee and West Tennessee. But as you know what's going to happen, a big party starts internally debating issues within the ranks. And so every 20 or 30 years, the Democrats would have such an incredible fight in their party over something like how you're going to pay off the state debt, prohibition, women's suffrage, that a Republican or a third-party candidate would get elected governor. That's very different from the other 10 states that left the Union in 1861, because the other states were the solid Democratic South. So now, after the election of Winfield Dunn, things have changed to some degree in that we do kind of leapfrog, but it's political parties that are doing the leapfrogging. And Tennessee, since the Civil Rights Movement, the Republican Party has gained a political voice in West Tennessee, which the Republican Party never had before the Civil Rights Movement of the late 1950s and early 1960s. What you saw happening there was that many conservative Democrats started voting Republican. And when that happened, the two parties became pretty well equalized in the state. So Governor Bredesen, who is a Democrat, followed a Republican governor, Don Sundquist, who followed a Democratic governor, Ned McWhorter, and it goes all the way back to the election of Winfield Dunn.
Well, if we're still doing leapfrogging of parties to some degree, even with the new term limits, what would be the logic behind putting a term limit limitation on the governor but not on the legislature?
In Tennessee, there's always been some, I'm not sure fear is the right word, but maybe it is. There's been a fear of the governor being too strong. And although we have strengthened the governor's office compared to earlier in our history, the governor in Tennessee, as in many southern states, is still not an especially strong, constitutionally speaking, not especially strong. For example, the governor in Tennessee has a veto, but to override the veto, you simply need a simple majority. In other words, the same majority that passed the law can simply vote again and override. A lot of it, I think, might go back to Reconstruction, when the governor at the time, a Republican, William G. Brownlow, was widely despised in Tennessee, hated by the former Confederates, particularly for his use of the state militia, the state guard. And if you look at Tennessee's Constitution, we've got a lot of little, picadillos, little unusual features in our Constitution that are in some ways a reaction against the power of the governor. So I think we've always had that concern about the power of the governor. Now, as to why we don't apply it to the legislature, I would suggest it's because the legislature doesn't want it applied to the legislature, and they make the law, and they also, since we don't generally have constitutional conventions, we amend the Constitution through the legislative process and then through the direct vote of the people, that the legislature simply has not seen fit to apply that to themselves.
Well, let me follow up on this idea of the power of the governor. The three of us were having a conversation before we started the taping of the idea that there are only so many positions that are actually elected by the people. Other states will elect different offices, whereas we simply elect our representatives to D.C. and the governor, statewide. All the rest are done by local elections. Doesn't that give the governor a great deal of power as far as appointments are concerned?
Well, it's interesting, the positions in Tennessee that are actually appointed by the legislature rather than the governor. For instance, the Secretary of State of Tennessee is appointed by the legislature. That position is looked at to some degree as a position that dispenses a great deal of patronage, and there are a lot of jobs associated with that. So when the Republican Party took over the state General Assembly in the past election, one of the first things they did was to replace the longtime Democratic Secretary of State, Riley Darnell, with a new Republican Secretary of State. The lieutenant governor in Tennessee is elected by the 33 members, one of which happens to be this person, in the state Senate. And so you have a lieutenant governor who is first in succession to the governor, should something happen to the governor while the governor is in office, that has only been elected by a small district of people. For example, in 1927, our governor, Austin Peay, died in office. This was the first time this had happened, and the lieutenant governor, Henry Horton, was the Speaker of the Senate, but he had only been voted on by the people of 3 counties in Tennessee. We used to have this Public Service Commission that the voters voted on statewide, but the legislature abolished that a few years ago and then created an appointed body, the Tennessee Regulatory Commission, to do the same job that the PSC was doing. The Attorney General's position in Tennessee is not elected. In many states, the Attorney General's position is an elected position. So we have very few appointments, relatively speaking, that the governor of Tennessee can make. The legislature clearly has a tremendous amount of power here. It's a weak governor, strong legislature system here in Tennessee.
and it's not uncommon throughout the South. And just to pick up on what Carole said, we do have other statewide constitutional offices, but the other three major ones are simply picked by the legislature: the treasurer, the comptroller, and the secretary of state. So really, we're only one of 3 states where the governor is the only statewide elected official on state level of government, not counting U.S. senators. And it is an unusual position to be in. And the governor certainly has more power now than he did before Austin Peay's reforms. He is in control of the executive branch. But still, comparatively speaking, the governor is relatively weak.